Modern observers typically view the historical clashes between religion and state as rival human institutions fighting for dominance over society. René Guénon argued that framing the conflict as a political struggle is a symptom of severe intellectual degradation in the West. Traditionalist metaphysics establishes a strict ontological hierarchy. The immutable must govern the changing. This diagram shows the concept of pure knowledge, represented as a stationary central axis within a sphere. The outer shell of this same sphere rotates rapidly to represent action, or the temporal world. Because action belongs to the world of change, it possesses no guiding principle within itself. Following Aristotelian logic, the moving circumference requires an unmoved mover, the stationary axis of knowledge. True spiritual authority is rooted in this pure knowledge, while temporal power is confined to the boundaries of action and physical force. Severing temporal power for spiritual authority unmoors the world from truth itself. Traditional social hierarchies functioned as exact mappings of human nature onto cosmic principles. This image captures the sacerdotal function. In the Hindu system, the Brahmin caste embodies sattva, intellectual light, and the orientation toward transcendent states. Below them are the kshatriyas, the royal and warrior class, who embody rajas, the expansive force that drives action and maintains outward order. The Brahmin's domain is pure metaphysics, the principles, while the kshatriya's domain is physics, the application of those principles within the material world. In a properly ordered society, the warrior holds visible power, while the priest exerts an invisible authority, acting as the quiet pivot around which the contingent world turns. Social order maintains legitimacy only when it reflects this hierarchical relationship between intellect and force. This matrix maps the dual nature of authority and power across different traditions. Knowledge and wisdom sit under spiritual authority. Action and force belong to temporal power. This aligns with the Hindu gunas, the white, upward tendency of sattva on the left, and the red, expansive impulse of rajas on the right. The initiations follow this split. The greater mysteries impart knowledge beyond nature, while lesser mysteries focus on nature's laws. The Egyptian Sphinx synthesizes these two columns. The human head represents the wisdom that directs, while the leonine body represents the physical force that acts. Depicting the Sphinx at rest shows temporal power held in potential, contained and guided by a higher principle. We see this same synthesis in the Roman god Janus. His two faces represent the single origin from which sacerdotal and royal mysteries flow. While the functions of priest and king appear distinct, they emerge from a unified, invisible origin. Because the royal class is engaged in action, they do not possess the highest knowledge themselves. They receive it by participating in the teachings of the sacerdotal class. The divine right of kings represents the transmission of a spiritual influence, or baraka. It is a strict delegation of authority that validates a monarch's temporal actions. In the Christian tradition, this is expressed through the power of the keys held by St. Peter, the authority to consecrate temporal reign or revoke it. The Eastern allegory of the blind man carrying the paralytic illustrates the mechanics of this relationship. The blind man provides mobility, while the paralyzed man on his shoulders provides vision and direction. Action, left to itself, is blind. Without the directing principle of knowledge, the temporal power's movements are vain agitation.
The extreme Oriental tradition recognizes this same requirement, calling it the mandate of heaven. Even within the social and civic doctrine of Confucius, scrutinizing the nature of things is the first necessary condition for governing a principality. Without vertical consecration, temporal power loses its connection to truth, becoming the temporary exertion of brute material force. When the temporal power attempts to declare independence, it initiates what Guénon calls the revolt of the kshatriyas. To justify this independence, the warrior class must deny the existence of any domain superior to their own. They substitute metaphysics for naturalism, the belief that nothing exists beyond the physical world and that all reality is subject to constant change. Historical symbols, like this medieval banner, show this usurpation. The royal color of red absorbs the emblem of spiritual authority. By declaring independence from transcendent principles, the temporal power reduces civilization entirely to human elements, marking the birth of individualism. Guénon identifies this as a Luciferian attitude, the refusal to recognize any authority superior to one's own will. Under this regime, the greater mysteries fade, leaving society with only the lesser mysteries, the sciences of nature, physics, and statecraft. This animated matrix shows the moment of rupture. The transmission line from the sacerdotal class is severed, and the temporal column expands its claim over society. The warriors are now unanchored, operating in a world of pure, turbulent change, without any fixed point of reference. While the temporal power believes it has achieved supreme authority, it has actually taken the first step toward its own destruction. By destroying the principle of hierarchy, the Kshatriyas destroy the only logic that justifies their own position at the top of the temporal order. Once the hierarchy of quality is replaced by the hierarchy of quantity, the warrior class is left with only material force as a justification for rule. They are then easily overwhelmed by the lower castes, who possess greater numbers and material weight. This leads to the domination of the Vaishyas, or the bourgeoisie, whose nature is oriented toward the lower guna of tamas, reducing all societal value to purely economic utility. Watch as this social pyramid collapses. Once the spiritual peak is removed, the temporal block is crushed by the mass of the economic and labor blocks expanding upward. This terminal state is the reign of the Shudras, an era of intellectual night where society is exclusively focused on material production. In this environment, science is reduced to profane knowledge, ignorance that studies the material world while mistaking it for absolute truth. The modern West represents the terminal stage of this specific historical cycle of degradation. Modernity's obsession with economic utility represents the mathematical result of the initial revolt against spiritual authority. Hindu tradition calls this era the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, defined by the negation of the spiritual order. René Guénon warns that unless a rapid intellectual redressing occurs, this unmoored civilization faces an absolute, accelerating catastrophe. Restoration begins in the intellectual domain, preceding any political or temporal action. Looking back at our original diagram, the rapidly spinning sphere of action must slow down, allowing the stationary central axis of truth to become visible once again. The supremacy of the spiritual over the temporal remains a permanent truth, regardless of its recognition by the modern state.